How are you today? Today we are going to take chapter 5, Time Twist. Chapter 5, The Visit. We said before in chapter 4, the children are waiting for the visit of Mr. Featherstone. Later that morning, Mr. Bleak looked worried. He rushed around the factory shouting orders. Fred and John put some fences around that machine. Now, he shouted, "You girls, clean those windows. They are very dirty. You two boys, sweep the floors." "What's the matter with Mr. Bleak?" asked a woman who was working with Lucy. "I have never seen him running around like this before." Lucy smiled to herself. When the factory was clean, Mr. Bleak called all the workers together. He stood on a box so that everyone could see him. "This afternoon, Mr. Featherstone is visiting the factory," he said. "He received a letter saying that the factory is unsafe and that bad things are happening here. I am very angry about this. Does anyone know who sent the letter?" The workers looked at each other and shook their heads. Mr. Bleak glared at them. "If I find out who sent the letter, there will be trouble. Is that understood?" "Yes, Mr. Bleak," agreed the workers sadly. "Mr. Featherstone must find everything perfect," continued Mr. Bleak. "You will tell him that you enjoy working in this factory and you are all treated well. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mr. Bleak," replied the workers. "While Mr. Featherstone is here, everyone will receive a bun to eat. You will tell him you have buns every day afternoon," said Mr. Bleak. Everyone knew that Mr. Bleak was only giving them buns to impress Mr. Featherstone. They had never had buns before. Mr. Bleak turned to the children in front of him and said, "You children will tell Mr. Featherstone that you are 9 years old. If Mr. Featherstone goes into the schoolroom, you will tell him that Mrs. Bleak is a kind and a good teacher. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mr. Bleak," replied the children. They knew it was wrong to tell lies, but they had no choice. Here, Mr. Bleak is sitting on a box to talk to the workers and to tell them what they will do when Mr. Featherstone visits us or visits them. "Being so kind," Tom continued. "Mrs. Bleak, what is the name of our dear queen?" "Queen Victoria," Mrs. Bleak replied Tom. "Good boy," said Mrs. Bleak, and patted his head. Tom thought she was going to hit him, so he was surprised to be patted. "Emmy," called Mrs. Bleak, "what is the name of our dear queen's husband?" Emmy thought hard, but she couldn't think of the answer. Mrs. Bleak stood behind Emmy and bent down. "Prince Albert." "You stupid child," she whispered. Here, Emmy is sitting, thinking of the answer, and Mrs. Bleak bent down to tell her the answer. 10 minutes later, all the workers and the children stood at the factory gates. They watched as Mr. Bleak loaded the cart with their bags. As the horse pulled the cart out of the factory gates, everyone cheered. Here Mr. Featherstone is sitting out, or he wants Mr. Bleak and Mrs. Bleak to leave the factory school because of what happened, or how because they treated the children badly and cruelly. Mr. Featherstone went over to George, Albert, Robert, and Lucy. There will be other changes, he promised. So Mr. Featherstone promised the children that there will be some changes in the future. I will find a proper teacher for the children, and they will work fewer hours in the factory. No child under the age of 9 will work in the factory at all. Children like Albert will have more time to play instead. The children thanked Mr. Featherstone about what he did with Mr. Bleak and Mrs. Bleak. He sent them out of the factory school, and they will made some changes in the factory school. The children thanked Mr. Featherstone. Thank you very much, Mr. Featherstone, said George. They thanked him very much, and Mr. Featherstone promised them that there will be some changes with the factory school. Mr. Featherstone smiled. Now we must go back to our own time, said Robert. We don't belong here. I know, George sighed, but perhaps we will meet again one day. Perhaps, smiled Robert. Robert and Lucy walked out of the factory gates. I'm glad the factory will be a better place, said Robert. Schools and the teachers have improved so much since Victorian times, replied Lucy. Perhaps schools in the future will be better still. Perhaps, said Robert. Let's find out, Lucy grinned. Let's travel to the future and see what our school will be like. Here, the children, Lucy and Robert, decided to travel to the future to see what their school will be like. Okay, let's choose a date. Robert smiled. Let's choose 2055. So the children, they typed 2055 into their phones, then the name of their school, and finally the password. They pressed the green buttons, and when they pressed the green buttons, everything went dark, and there was a sound like the rushing of wind. For a second time, Robert and Lucy felt themselves rushing forward through time at an alarming speed. Now we have finished chapter 5 in our story Time Twist, and the next chapter, in chapter 6, we will know more events in the future 2055 in the new school. Thank you so much and goodbye. See you next time. Good morning, grade 6. How are you today? Today we are going to take chapter 6 in our story Time Twist. Welcome to Woodfield Junior. Now the children is going to the future. They traveled to the future in 2055 to see how their new school will be. At last, the sound of rushing wind stopped, and the darkness was replaced by light. Robert and Lucy found themselves outside their school, Woodfield Junior. It looked very different now. They were in the future. The windows were made from grey glass, which made it hard to see inside. There was a high steel fence around the school, and steel gates at the entrance. Robert and Lucy recognized the houses near the school, but they looked much older. All the trees surrounding the school were much taller too. Robert and Lucy walked through the steel gates into the school grounds. and looked around. Everywhere was covered in gray concrete. There were no flowers, no trees, no pond, and no seats. It looked very bleak. Lucy pulled a face. It was so different. This is what our school will look like in the future, said Robert. I don't think I like it, replied Lucy. It doesn't look friendly anymore. Look, our beautiful school garden has gone too. Robert looked at what had once been the school garden. Now it was an empty concrete square. Isn't it quick? Isn't it so quiet? He said. He pointed to the clock tower. The beautiful old school clock had been replaced with a digital display. The time on the display said 10 o'clock. Here there are a big difference between the children's school in the past and the children's school in the future. The children did not like their school in the future. They liked their school in the past. It looks friendly, but in the future it looks unfriendly to them. Everything changed in their school. Usually the school would be really noisy at this time. Where is everyone? Asked Lucy. Let's go and find out, said Robert. They walked down the concrete path and pushed open the main door. Inside the school was a quiet and empty corridor. Robert and Lucy walked down it. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the silence. They looked in all the classrooms along the way, but no one was there. They went to the staff room, but no one was there either. How strange, muttered Lucy. Where are all the pupils and the teachers? Let's go to the hall, said Robert. Perhaps everyone is there. Robert opened the door and peeped inside. Here, the children are in their classroom, and the robot is the teacher. The robot teaches the children their subjects. I would hate our history lessons to be like this, muttered Robert. Our teacher makes history really interesting, whispered Lucy. Suddenly the lesson stopped. Stand up now, commanded the robot, and the children stood up. Walk around the hall 3 times, continued the robot. And the children walked around the hall 3 times. Sit down now, commanded the robot. And the children sat down. Now, geography, said the robot. All the children got out their geography books. In silence, they watched the screen. Lots more writing appeared on it. This time, the writing was about how different mountains are formed. The robot gave the lesson in the same dull way as the history lesson. Robert and Lucy were amazed. This is terrible, whispered Lucy. How can the children learn if they have no proper teachers to help them? How can you stay awake long enough to learn anything? Asked Robert. He pointed to the boy who had fallen asleep before. He was fighting sleep again. Suddenly, a bell sounded and the children stood up. Where is everyone going? Robert asked the boy who was sitting next to him. It's a break time, he replied. Come on, I'll show you to the playground. Robert and Lucy stared at each other. Why had books and the teachers been removed from school? The school of the future didn't seem like a good place at all. But then a bell sounded. All the children formed a long line and went back inside. Time for some more lessons, sighed Anton. Come on, follow us. The children went inside. Suddenly, Lucy noticed something moving. She looked up. There was a camera high up on the wall. Lucy watched it. It was following them as they walked down the corridor. Someone was watching them. But who? Here, the children are looking for the camera that someone is watching them. Here we have finished reading chapter 6 in our story Time Twist. Thank you so much. Goodbye and see you next time.